He said I lacked team spirit as he fumbled through the wrong equal employment form I'd already corrected twice that morning. That was the third time this week the new VP tried to skip federal documentation on a discrimination complaint because it created unnecessary drama. Drama. That word had become like cheap cologne around Excelsior Industries lately. Strong, obvious, and trying too hard to cover up something that stunk. I'm Chuck Patterson, 49 years old, and I'd been swimming in this corporate fishbowl for 18 years. 18 years of staying late to document compliance violations, of keeping the EEOC happy, of explaining patiently, always patiently, to fresh MBA graduates why federal contractor obligations aren't suggestions. I'd written half the employment compliance manual these people skimmed before strutting into board meetings like they invented workplace law. But every time I opened my mouth about proper procedures, I got the same look you'd give a smoke detector that dared to beep during dinner. Necessary, but annoying. They called me thorough. That's corporate speak for right, but we wish you weren't. I was the federal compliance liaison, meaning my signature didn't just close employee files, it kept us eligible for government contracts worth 40% of our revenue. You want to bid on anything over $5 million with Uncle Sam, you don't get to submit paperwork until I verify we're clean with equal employment. Quiet power. The kind that matters when auditors show up unannounced. But let's be honest, none of that mattered when Bradley Hoffman was posturing for the executive committee. I was background noise, the guy who slowed down the machine with his pesky federal requirements. By the way, if you've made it this far, and you like stories where the quiet guy everyone ignores ends up holding the nuclear codes, stick around. This gets a lot better. On this particular Tuesday, my federal contractor badge tapped against the conference table as I leaned in to correct his numbers. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't roll my eyes. I simply said, per EEOC guidelines, that complaint needs full documentation before we can close the file. Brad smiled, tight and brittle like his confidence was held together with dental floss. Actually, Chuck, that only applies if we determine there's merit to the complaint. I held up the case file. The complainant documented 3 separate incidents with witnesses. Federal guidelines require investigation regardless of our opinion on merit. Silence. Then that awful, slow-motion realization that settles over a room when someone realizes they've already lit the fuse without checking if the bomb's been defused. But Brad doubled down, called my approach inflexible, said I was creating hostile work environments with my excessive documentation requirements. I almost laughed. It took effort not to. The other HR staff avoided eye contact. Legal stared at his laptop. The CFO, the only one who truly understood what federal contractor status meant to our bottom line, sat frozen, probably calculating revenue loss in his head. I sat back, quiet, already running the math. Not emotionally, mechanically, like watching someone try to fix a carburetor with a butter knife. They never understood what that compliance badge represented. To them, it was paperwork. To me, it was a loaded weapon with federal backing. The thing about working compliance for 18 years is you learn to see the train wrecks before they happen. You watch people make decisions based on what sounds good in a PowerPoint presentation instead of what actually keeps you out of federal court. Brad was one of those guys who thought regulations were suggestions and that confidence could substitute for knowledge. He'd been VP for exactly 6 months, brought in from some tech startup that had never dealt with government contracts. His big claim to fame was streamlining processes at his previous job, which apparently meant cutting anything that looked like extra paperwork. What he didn't understand was that in federal contracting, that paperwork wasn't extra. It was the whole point. I'd tried to explain this during his first week, sat him down with the compliance manual, walked through the OFCCP requirements, showed him the audit trail that kept us eligible for government work. He'd nodded and smiled and made all the right noises, then promptly ignored every word I'd said. His first improvement was eliminating what he called redundant witness interviews for EEO complaints. His second was shortening the investigation timeline from 30 days to 10 days. His third was delegating my sign-off authority to whoever happened to be available when paperwork needed processing. Each change violated federal contractor requirements. Each change put our government contracts at risk. Each change made us more money in the short term by cutting corners we weren't allowed to cut. I documented every violation, sent memos explaining the risks, and watched them get filed away in whatever digital folder companies use for inconvenient truths. The worst part wasn't that Brad didn't understand federal compliance. The worst part was that he didn't think he needed to. He'd hired his wife Stephanie as a senior HR coordinator, despite her having roughly the same federal experience as a parking meter. Her main qualification was being married to the boss and having a degree from a decent college. Her main responsibility was to smile and nod when Brad explained his latest brilliant innovation in workplace efficiency. But federal regulations don't care about your efficiency innovations. They don't care about your streamlined processes or your collaborative approaches. They care about documentation, proper procedures, and having someone who actually knows what they're doing running the show. Brad was about to learn that lesson the hard way, and unfortunately for everyone at Excelsior Industries, the tuition was going to cost them more than they could afford. Then Brad said the words that started a countdown clock nobody else could hear. "Chuck, I think we need someone more aligned with modern HR practices. Your old school approach just doesn't fit our evolving culture." I didn't blink. I stood up, unclipped my federal liaison badge, and placed it on the mahogany table next to his untouched energy drink. No dramatic speeches, no threats, just that little plastic card sitting there like a pin pulled from a grenade. As I walked out, the conference room door hadn't even closed completely before I heard someone ask, "Wait, what exactly does that badge authorize?" They'd learn soon enough. The quarterly compliance review was always theater. Think community theater for people in expensive suits, except with worse acting and more acronyms. I'd been through 72 of them, enough to know that actual knowledge was optional, but looking busy while shuffling papers was mandatory. Brad had decided this was his moment to shine. He wore a charcoal suit so new I could smell the sizing, and he had that smirk people get when they think they're about to teach Einstein about physics. He'd brought his wife Stephanie, freshly promoted to senior HR coordinator despite having roughly the same federal compliance experience as a parking meter. "Due to organizational restructuring," he began, clicking through slides like he was announcing lottery numbers, "we've streamlined our compliance protocols to eliminate redundancy and accelerate case resolution." I was sitting 2 rows back, technically not even supposed to be there, but my body moved before my brain caught up. I cleared my throat. "Excuse me," I said, voice steady but loud enough to cut through his presentation. Federal contractor obligations require documented investigation of all EEO complaints within 30 days. Streamlining doesn't override OFCCP requirements. He turned, that smirk already cracking around the edges. "Thanks for the input, Chuck, but we've confirmed our new process meets all necessary guidelines." "No," I said calmly, pulling out the compliance manual I'd brought just in case. "You've eliminated the witness interview phase and the written findings requirement. Both are mandatory for federal contractors." The air got thick fast. You could feel the oxygen getting sucked out of the room. Someone from legal shifted in their seat. The division president frowned into his coffee, pretending to read emails he wasn't typing. Brad's face went the color of overripe tomatoes. He clicked to the next slide like maybe PowerPoint would save him. "We'll address specific implementation details offline," he muttered. That's when he made it personal. "Before we move on," he said, stepping out from behind the podium, "there's one more organizational update." He turned to face the room like he was announcing the weather. "Effective immediately, Chuck's position is being restructured. We appreciate his years of service, but we're moving toward a more collaborative compliance approach." It landed with the sound of a car door slamming in an empty parking lot. Even the CEO blinked like someone had just announced the building was on fire. There was no warning memo, no restructuring announcement, just this. I waited a beat, looked around the room. Nobody met my eyes. Classic. I stood up. No tears, no tantrums, just the bone-deep fatigue of a man who'd spent 2 decades explaining the same simple concepts to people who thought complexity was a sign of stupidity. I reached up, unclipped my federal liaison badge, and set it on the presentation table. It was heavier than it looked. Not in weight, but in what it carried. Authority that room full of MBAs would never understand. I walked out without saying another word. Nobody stopped me, nobody asked questions, and most importantly, nobody asked what that badge actually controlled. My exit package fit in a cardboard box that had previously held printer paper. 18 years of institutional knowledge reduced to a coffee mug, a desk calendar, and a half-dead spider plant I'd kept alive since the Clinton administration. No ceremony, no handshakes, just the fluorescent hum of corporate indifference. I sent one email before I cleaned out my desk. Subject line: Federal Liaison Status. Immediate attention required. Body text: Compliance badge returned. OFCCP liaison role unassigned. 30-day audit window active. See, there's a database the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs keeps. Not public, not even visible to most companies. It tracks federal contractor compliance officers by registration number, by company, by last verification date. And, as of 3:47 p.m. that Tuesday, my name had been flagged as separated, role unassigned. Normally, that triggers a straightforward process. HR notifies the compliance department, compliance initiates a replacement protocol, OFCCP gets pinged, they ask for updated documentation, everyone signs forms, nice and tidy. But guess what happens when you fire the only guy who knows that process exists? Exactly nothing happens. Nobody else even knew the database existed. At 3:52 p.m., the OFCCP compliance tracking system sent out its standard alert. Contractor liaison status change. Verification required within 30 days. The system pinged our company profile with a little orange flag. Might as well have been blinking. You're about to be in deep trouble in Morse code. But nobody saw it. Nobody looked for it because Brad, in all his MBA glory, had already told the executive committee that my duties were largely administrative. He'd waved off any transition planning with some nonsense about empowering the team to evolve our processes. His role was mostly paperwork, he'd said later, according to the Slack conversation I still had access to. Stephanie can handle the routine stuff, and will cross-train the team on anything complex. Stephanie, bless her heart, was a good person. But the only federal compliance she'd ever handled was her student loan paperwork. The badge stayed in Brad's desk drawer, like a forgotten key to a vault nobody remembered locking. And behind the scenes, the federal system just waited. 30 days. That's all OFCCP gives you before a contractor's compliance status gets flagged for review. And when that happens, all your pending government bids get frozen until you prove you're following the rules. I could have warned them, could have sent an anonymous email, made a phone call. But what was the point? They didn't want warnings. They wanted modern solutions, streamlined processes, collaborative approaches, so I let them collaborate their way into federal oversight. 3 weeks after my departure, I was sitting in my garage organizing 18 years' worth of compliance documentation I'd kept as backup files. Call it professional paranoia, but I'd learned early that when federal auditors show up, having extra paperwork never hurt anybody. My phone buzzed with a LinkedIn notification. Excelsior Industries had just announced a major federal contract win, $47 million for manufacturing defense logistics equipment. The press release used words like strategic partnership and national security contribution. The comments section was full of congratulations and flag emojis. I'd worked on that bid proposal for 6 months. Every piece of compliance documentation, every federal certification, every OFCCP requirement had my fingerprints on it. And now they'd won it, just in time for their compliance status to implode. Because winning the bid was just step one. Actually getting the money required passing a federal contractor compliance audit, and that audit was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I refreshed the OFCCP contractor database, still publicly accessible if you knew where to look. Excelsior Industries, compliance status, under review, liaison officer unassigned, last verification expired. That little orange flag had turned red. The audit happened on a Tuesday morning, because federal bureaucrats love Tuesdays almost as much as they love catching contractors who thought they were smarter than the system. I wasn't there, obviously, but I heard about it from Janet in accounts payable, who'd kept in touch after I left. Janet was the kind of woman who noticed everything and forgot nothing, which made her both excellent at her job and dangerous to anyone trying to hide something. According to Janet, the federal auditor arrived at 9 a.m. sharp. Government sedan, government haircut, government attitude. The kind of man who'd learned to spot BS from 50 yards and had zero patience for corporate tap dancing. Brad met him in the lobby, all confidence and cologne. "We're excited to showcase our compliance program," he said, according to Janet, who'd been standing nearby pretending to check mail. "Where's your designated federal liaison officer?" the auditor asked, consulting his tablet. "That position has been restructured," Brad replied smoothly. "We have a more collaborative approach now." The auditor stopped walking. Sir, federal contractor regulations require a designated OFCCP liaison. It's not optional. That's when the panic started. Not loud panic, but the quiet kind that spreads through a building like carbon monoxide. Brad called Stephanie. Stephanie called legal. Legal called the CEO. The CEO called an emergency meeting. By 10:30 a.m., they'd assembled everyone who'd ever heard the words equal employment in the main conference room. The auditor sat at one end of the table, his folder thick enough to stop bullets. Brad sat at the other end, his confidence leaking like air from a punctured tire. I need to review your EEO complaint documentation for the past 18 months, the auditor said, opening his folder. Starting with case numbers 2023-0847 through 2024-0156. Stephanie looked through the files they'd brought. Paper shuffled. Minutes passed. Finally, she said, I'm not seeing the witness interview documentation for most of these cases. Those weren't required under our streamlined process, Brad interjected. The auditor's pen stopped moving. Sir, witness interviews are mandatory for federal contractors. Who authorized eliminating them? Our compliance officer determined they were redundant, Brad said. And where is this compliance officer? He's no longer with the company. When did he leave? 3 weeks ago. Who replaced him? Brad gestured toward Stephanie. We promoted from within. The auditor looked at Stephanie. What's your federal compliance certification number? Stephanie blinked. My what? That was the moment the room realized they weren't just in trouble. They were in federal violation territory, where ignorance isn't a defense and good intentions don't count for much. The auditor closed his folder. The sound was like a car door slamming on a marriage. This facility is out of compliance with OFCCP requirements. Your federal contractor status is suspended pending remediation. What does that mean exactly? The CEO asked. It means your $47 million contract is frozen until you demonstrate compliance. It also means we'll be conducting a full investigation into your employment practices, with potential penalties ranging from warning letters to contract termination and financial sanctions. Brad tried one more time. Surely there's some kind of grace period for administrative transitions. The auditor didn't even blink. Sir, federal employment law doesn't have grace periods for discrimination complaints. You've been operating without proper oversight for 3 weeks. We found 23 EEO cases that weren't properly investigated according to federal standards. Stephanie raised her hand like she was in 3rd grade. Can we fix this retroactively? Each improperly handled case carries a potential fine of up to $800,000. You could have heard a pin drop in the next county. Janet later told me the CEO's face went so white she thought he might need medical attention. 23 cases times 800,000, the CFO whispered. Doing math, nobody wanted him to finish. 18.4 million in potential fines the auditor finished for him, plus administrative costs and potential contract cancellation penalties. The audit lasted 3 more hours, but the outcome was never in doubt. When federal contractors eliminate required compliance procedures, the government takes it personally. When they do it right before cashing a $47 million check, the government takes it very personally. By 4 p.m., Excelsior Industries had received an official OFCCP violation notice. By 5 p.m., their federal contracts were suspended. By close of business, their legal department was drafting settlement negotiations that would eventually cost them $18.6 million in fines and compliance remediation. Brad was escorted out the following morning. Not by security, just by HR with a cardboard box and a very awkward conversation about how his streamlined approach had streamlined the company right into federal court. Stephanie lasted another week before requesting a transfer to a non-compliance role. Turns out when your husband's brilliant idea cost the company nearly $20 million, the workplace gets a little uncomfortable. My phone rang on a Friday evening, 3 months after the audit. Private number, but I answered anyway. Chuck? This is Walsh from Hartwell Industries. We heard about your availability. Hartwell was Excelsior's biggest competitor. They'd been trying to break into federal contracting for years. We need a federal compliance director, Walsh continued. Someone who actually understands OFCCP requirements. The position comes with a 30% increase over your previous salary, plus a signing bonus, plus oversight of our new government contracts division. I sipped my coffee and watched my neighbor's dog chase squirrels in the backyard. What kind of government contracts are you targeting? Well, funny you should ask. Excelsior just lost a $47 million defense logistics contract. DoD is rebidding it next month. I almost smiled. Send me the details. The Hartwell offer was everything Excelsior should have been. A company that understood federal compliance wasn't just paperwork. It was the foundation of their entire government contracts business. They'd been watching Excelsior's implosion from the sidelines, and they wanted someone who could help them avoid making the same mistakes. During my interview, the Hartwell CEO asked me directly, "What happened over there? We heard it was a compliance disaster, but the details are still pretty murky." I kept it professional. They eliminated required federal procedures to speed up their processes. When the audit came, they couldn't demonstrate compliance with OFCCP requirements. The penalties were significant. How significant? $18.6 million in fines, plus they lost their federal contractor status for 6 months. Had to hire outside consultants to rebuild their entire compliance program from scratch. He whistled low. And they fired you for trying to prevent this? They fired me for what they called inflexibility. I called it following federal law. That sealed the deal. Within a week, I had a corner office, a proper budget for compliance staff, and most importantly, management that actually listened when I explained why certain procedures existed. 6 months later, I was sitting in my new office, federal liaison badge properly displayed on my desk, reviewing the compliance documentation for Hartwell's $52 million defense contract. The same contract Excelsior had lost, plus a $5 million expansion they'd never even gotten to bid on because their contractor status was still under review. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was now overseeing the very same type of work I'd been doing at Excelsior, except now I was respected for it instead of fired for it. My compliance team actually came to me with questions instead of trying to work around me. Management asked for my input on new policies instead of eliminating procedures I'd spent years perfecting, but the real satisfaction came from something deeper than just professional vindication. At Hartwell, federal compliance wasn't seen as an obstacle to business. It was seen as what enabled the business. They understood that government contracts came with government oversight, and that oversight required expertise, not just enthusiasm. My assistant knocked and entered. "Mr. Patterson? There's a call from someone at Excelsior Industries. Says it's about a consulting opportunity." I looked up from the OFCCP compliance manual I was reviewing, the one I'd helped write during my 18 years of inflexible service. "Tell them I'm in a meeting," I said. "A very important compliance meeting that can't be interrupted." The truth was, I'd heard through industry channels that Excelsior was struggling. The $18.6 million fine had been just the beginning. They'd lost 3 more government contracts during their suspension period. Their insurance rates had skyrocketed after the federal violations. 2 major commercial clients had pulled out, citing concerns about the company's regulatory compliance. They'd eventually hired a big consulting firm to rebuild their compliance program, but consultants charge by the hour and don't stick around for the long haul. What they really needed was someone who understood both the letter and the spirit of federal employment law. Someone who could build sustainable processes instead of quick fixes. Someone like the guy they'd fired for trying to protect them from exactly this scenario. But that wasn't my problem anymore. I had a new company that valued my expertise, a team that respected institutional knowledge, and the professional satisfaction of watching my former employer learn the hard way that experience beats innovation when the government's writing the checks. 3 months after that consulting inquiry, I heard that Excelsior had finally regained their federal contractor status. It had cost them nearly $25 million total. Fines, legal fees, consultant costs, and lost revenue during the suspension. Brad was long gone, working for some tech startup that didn't do government work. Stephanie had transferred to a customer service role where federal compliance wasn't part of the job description. The company survived, but barely. They'd had to lay off 15% of their workforce and sell off a subsidiary to cover the costs of their compliance disaster. The executives who'd nodded along when Brad explained his streamlined approach were now explaining to shareholders why profits were down 40% for the year. Meanwhile, at Hartwell, we were hiring. Our government contracts division had grown by 200% in the past year, largely because we had a reputation for solid compliance and reliable performance. When federal auditors showed up at our facilities, they found properly documented procedures, certified compliance officers, and a culture that treated regulatory requirements as professional standards rather than bureaucratic obstacles. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't getting mad, it's watching people learn the hard way that experience isn't just about knowing how to do things right. It's about knowing exactly what happens when you do them wrong. Federal regulations don't care about your streamlined processes or your collaborative approaches. They care about documentation, proper procedures, and having someone who actually knows what they're doing in charge of compliance. Turns out old school wasn't the problem, it was the solution. They just figured it out about $18.6 million too late. Thanks for listening, folks. Remember, in government contracting, respect for the rules isn't optional, it's profitable.